The mafia boss's baby wouldn't stop crying on the plane until a single mother did the unthinkable. The wail cut through first class like a sheet of glass. Heads turned, forks stilled midair. Outside the oval window, the Atlantic lay cold and indifferent, but inside the cabin, every warm thing contracted around the sound. A man with a tie dug his nails into his knuckles. A flight attendant's smile hardened into a posture of helplessness, and a woman in a mauve scarf pressed her hand to her throat as if the sound might be contagious. Dominic Santoro had heard worse. He had survived gunfire and betrayed promises and the slow unraveling of alliances that had left his name both feared and clean-cut in the mouths that spoke it. He had not heard this before. The small, clean, raw sound of a life that could not defend itself against nothing more than hunger and confusion. Dominic said to the infant, the name slipping out without the armor he normally wore. He kept his voice low, clipped like the rest of his sentences. He was used to controlling rooms with a look, to folding chaos into plans. He was not used to lullabies. He could not remember the last time he had attempted one and not felt foolish doing it. The baby arched and screamed again, a bright, raw complaint that made Dominic's jaw ache. He had learned to calculate the world in margins and risks. The baby's crying was not a variable he had budgeted for on this flight. He cradled Marco close enough to feel the baby's heat, close enough to smell that newborn sweetness, milk, detergent, his mother's skin. Dominic's hands shook. For a man who had ordered the movement of people like chess pieces, that small, wordless demand felt like an accusation. He had brought Marco into the world and somehow failed him before the child could even understand the concept of failure. Isabella had been gone for 8 months. The bed still smelled faintly of her perfume in rooms he rarely entered. The nursery remained perfect and small, a museum to a life he could not salvage. The crying kept rising. Dominic's eyes scanned the cabin. An elderly couple tried soft words that rolled off the infant's ears. A toddler in the row behind began to whimper in sympathy. Dominic clenched his other hand around a magazine he had not read, the printed page folding into his palm like a promise. "Sir, we can move you to the bar at the back," the flight attendant offered, her professional smile thin as paper. "It's quieter. We have a bassinet." "No," Dominic said. His voice was a stone. To relocate would attract attention. He had not wanted to travel with Marco in the first place. Necessity and a meeting in Rome had pushed his hand. He had paid for the extra seats, the private service. He had expected the world to bend. He had not expected a single intractable human voice to demand otherwise. Across the aisle, a woman stood. She moved without the manner of the well-heeled passengers. She carried no laptop, no silk, no designer label that announced itself. She had a pediatric nurse's posture, shoulders rounded, hands always poised to fold into care. Her coat was rumpled as if it had been slept in the back of a car. When she stepped forward, a hush bent around her. Dominic registered the ache of her face, a small, private thing that suggested loss, the kind of grief not visible in the headlines. She met his eyes without fear. "May I try?" she asked. She wasn't offering service. She was offering something more intimate. Dominic's first reaction was suspicion. What did a stranger want with his son? The flight hummed, engines and murmurs creating a brittle safety. He did not want to hand Marco to anyone. He did not want to be thankful to anyone either. "You can't," he began, but found his voice thin. The woman's gaze did not plead. It was steady in a way that made him feel both seen and ridiculous. He knew how to read people. Something in the set of her mouth told him she had been up for this moment before she'd even decided to ask. She held out a folded scarf in one hand, another hand extended. "I'm a nurse, pediatrics. I've worked with newborns. It's okay to say no." The edges of Dominic's world had always been negotiated through transactions, favor for favor, protection for fealty. This felt like none of that. It felt like surrender. He let out an exhale that was half a laugh, half a sob. "Do what you must," he said. The woman moved with practiced ease despite the close quarters of the cabin. She spoke in a low voice as she gathered Marco from Dominic's arms, murmuring the kind of nonsense one says to a crying child. Not cures, not a table of remedies, but the tonic of human closeness. She tucked a hand beneath the baby's head, hold shaped as if she had done it 1,000 times. Dominic watched the way her thumb brushed the gap between Marco's lips and found himself unaccountably ashamed at the distance he had kept from the baby for months. She disappeared into the lavatory with an apologetic nod to the flight attendant and the privacy of a cramped airplane mirror. Dominic sat back and refused to watch, but his ears were windows. He could hear the muffled sitcom of the airplane, the soft metallic click of a door, the hurried step of a steward, and behind all of it, the small, urgent sucking of a baby who had finally found a shore. Sarah Mitchell had not planned to breastfeed anyone that day. She had packed practical things, changing pads, a squashed paperback, a sweater that smelled faintly of her washing machine. She had not packed the intentions of a life defined by a child's absence. The loss of Emma sat on her like an old ache, a curtain of quiet that she carried into every crowded room. She wore grief like a second skin, thin enough to let light through but still present, the reflexive glance for a small shoe by the door, the way her hands kept the rhythm of someone who once soothed. When the baby had taken to her, calming as if it had always known her scent, Sarah felt a dizzying double edge of relief and sorrow. She did not believe in miracles. She believed in work and patience and all the small, practical interventions that kept infants alive. But she also believed, stubbornly, in touch. The child's fingers splayed against her breast. A tiny fist closed, then opened, then relaxed. The sound in the lavatory had changed from a keening to a sequence of contented sighs. Sarah's shoulders lowered. Her own heart, which had been tight and small for so long, loosened. She thought of Emma, and for a flash of terror, she imagined what she would do if someone looked at her with the way Dominic Santoro looked, ravaged, raw, the world all at once bigger and more dangerous because of him. She would want to protect him. She would not yet have the language to keep herself safe. "Are you all right?" Dominic asked once she emerged. He had moved without prelude, as if he had always been standing outside the lavatory, waiting for the door to open. His coat hung over the back of the seat. He still smelled faintly of cedar and something sharp that might have been incense. When he saw the pacifying curve of Marco's face, the baby slack and small against Sarah's blouse, he made a noise that was almost gratitude. "Thank you," he said. He did not say it clumsily. He did not offer payment or protection. He just said it, and it landed between them like an offering. Sarah felt the weight of it. She had not meant to be thanked by a man like him. She had not meant to be called unthinkable. "I did," she began, then stopped. Because what could she say? "I am sorry for your loss. I lost mine too." Both were true, and both felt like frail bridges across separate tragedies. They sat. The baby slept. Dominic, who had been taught to assess risk in milliseconds, realized he had just stood with his son and a stranger in an airplane lavatory and survived something he could not have planned. He felt foolish and grateful all at once, a mixture he did not know how to contain. "Where are you headed?" he asked finally, because men of his world always filled silences with information. It was a small measure of safety. "Home," Sarah said. "Back to Boston. My shift resumes in 2 days." She touched the seatbelt with a finger. You? Rome, Dominic said. Business. Family. There was a pause where the plane's hum became the only conversation between them, and in that pause, every passenger's curiosity bent toward Dominic because he occupied a kind of space that folded light. People felt the outline of consequence when he was near. Sarah felt it too, and she kept her eyes honest. She had learned in the unglamorous hours on pediatric wards to look at people by the shapes they made under stress. Dominic seemed to carry his grief like a coat he had refused to take off. "When we land, I could get you a hotel dinner," he offered. "It's the least." She said no at first because she always said no to such offers. But then she thought of Marco's small hand gripping her, of how she'd let someone else soothe him, and how right it had felt. She thought of the gentle authority in Dominic's voice, and the way his eyes softened when he watched Marco sleep. He was, despite everything, a man who loved a child. "Temporary," she said. "Just dinner. For the baby. I'm not looking for anything else." Dominic blinked, and a brief, genuine laugh escaped him. He liked the word temporary. It made his world calculable. He would quantify the time. He would survey his options. It fit his habits. "Temporary," he agreed. By the time the plane rolled and the slow decompression toward the terminal began, the small group of passengers who had been watching dispersed. Dominic moved like a man who could glide past crowds without being touched. Sarah gathered her bag with the practiced hands of someone who had known the economy of belongings. What would survive a move, what wouldn't. Before they left the jet bridge, Dominic handed her a card. It was heavy and black, his name embossed like a promise. He did not ask for anything in return. He simply said, "If you find yourself with time, the Santoro estate offers a private nursery. We have staff." The last words were nominal. He had authority, and he used it like a gentle weapon. Sarah kept the card because she was a nurse, and because she was lonely, and because sometimes the world offered absurd chances. She kept it mostly for the way Dominic's voice had sounded when he said Marco's name, like a wound being claimed. "If this is gripping you, stay with us." They left separate ways through the terminal, Dominic to his driver and his private car, Sarah to the public shuttle that would take her to a motel because she could not afford the sterile luxury of a first-class chance. The world resumed its ordinary humidity, but things had shifted. In a bag, a black card. In the chest of a man who had everything, an ache softened by a stranger's hands. In the head of a woman with no illusions, the flaring possibility that some acts of service crossed lines people in Dominic's life would not have expected. Dominic returned to his town like a man who had been a hairbreadth away from losing the one thing he could not replace, his child. The security of the Santoro compound received him with its familiar geometry: stone, iron gates, guards who moved like shadows. The estate sat on a cliff like a cathedral of private law. Within its walls, rules had been enforced and debts collected for generations under the name Santoro. On the drive back to the estate, she noticed how different that world seemed when you approached it as a supplicant. The gates rose like the mouths of animals, and the guards looked at her with the dispassionate professionalism of people trained to neutralize risk before it could speak. Someone greeted her at a small, private entrance and led her through corridors that smelled of older money, leather, lemon oil, cedar. Teresa met her at the nursery door like someone offering a hand. Dominic was in the room, and he rose when he saw her, not because he had to, but because some small etiquette required it. They spoke with practical attitudes that belied the ritual weight of the situation. Dominic was careful to be respectful of her time, of his title, and of everything in between. In the parlor later, over a meal that tasted of too many ways to be polished, Dominic asked offhand about her experience. Sarah answered honestly: infants, premature workups, bottle training, the odd triumph of a child learning a sucking rhythm. She did not lecture, she described quietly, with the competence of someone who had spent hours with crying babies and exhausted parents. "A week," Dominic said finally. "A week?" Sarah repeated, because she was measuring distance in days. She had an apartment to return to, a job, and a life. A week might be theft of both. "To help transition him to bottles," Dominic clarified, "to get him stabilized." Sarah looked at him. She thought of how Marco had fallen quiet in her arms, how a simple human action had settled a storm. She thought of Emma, and how she had once imagined all she would do to save a child if she could, if chance allowed, with the constraints of economy and bureaucracy. Offering help had felt like a small reclamation of who she'd been. "I'll do it," she said. Teresa produced a document as if it were a commonplace thing, a temporary assignment, terms of stay, confidentiality clauses. The legal language was quick and cold against the warm soft of the conversation. Dominic watched her sign. He resisted folding into the impulse to take it all back the way he took back favors. The Santoro family had traditions older than the estate's stone. They had rules about mothers, manor, and lineage. He had damped those rules, contained them under velvet and practicality for the sake of a son whose health meant more than titles. Later that evening, when the house had thinned into servants' quiet and distant lights, Dominic stood at the nursery door and watched Sarah settle into a chair while Marco drifted in his sleep. The sight of her there, ordinary, unadorned, a nurse who had not wanted to be thanked, shifted him. He had prepared a world in which family meant inheritance, power, and duty. He had not prepared for the sense that the boy at the center of that network might pull power from his hands like a magnet. He told himself he would remain practical. He would keep the schedules, pay the help, manage the expectations. He would not let sentiment dictate policy. But when Marco hiccuped in his sleep and a soft hand moved to pat the small back, Dominic felt the old architecture of his life tremble. In the kitchen, Luca watched the two of them through a half-open pantry door. Luca was the sort of man who read corridors and codes like others read weather. He had been with Dominic long enough to know what the Santoro name meant, as both blessing and burden. He knew that traditions were not just stories, but tools to hold a family together. He also knew how rival families listened for weakness. "You brought someone in," he said quietly when Dominic joined him by the stove. "It's temporary," Dominic said. He stirred his coffee like someone performing a small litany. She calmed him. Luca did not press. He didn't have to. Nights unspooled with small, sharp issues. Men needed whispering on corners. Debts required collection. Alliances repackaged. Bringing an outsider into the nursery created a kind of public fact that would be noticed. "That woman," Luca said. "She's a nurse?" "She's a mother," Dominic corrected. "She lost someone." Silence folded them. Dominic's grief was an uneven topography that Luca had mapped in careful, businesslike edges. He did not presume to comfort Dominic. He would, when the time came, execute plans. For now, he made notes. "It will raise questions," Luca said. "You know that." Dominic nodded. It was a small statement, acceptance without surrender. He thought of Isabella and the way the house held her memory like an unopened letter. He thought of Marco and the way a child's wail had orchestrated a change he had not authorized. Word traveled the way such things did. Discreet inquiries, a messenger at a late hour, a subtle photograph taken on a terrace. The Santoro household was a machine that absorbed noise and sometimes coughed out consequences. A rival family might recast Sarah's presence as a political move, a way to push against Dominic by claiming an emotional lever. In their world, the body of a woman who had nursed a Santoro child could be spun into ritual, into obligation. That was the old language of power. Sarah noticed odd things: a van that lingered outside the gate, a man at a cafe who watched the servants' entrance, a caller that asked questions about her past with an intimacy that felt manufactured. She told herself not to be paranoid. Her work had taught her to attribute too much to coincidence. But when Teresa pulled her aside that morning and asked with the tone of someone who tended to ancient structures, "Do you understand what this means, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah braced herself. "No," she said, candid, "I don't." Teresa's gaze was patient and hard. "In my mother's time, a woman who fed a Don's child was given a kind of consideration. It was not law, but it was a protection and an obligation. It could be used to bind, if families chose to interpret it so." Sarah felt the word obligation like another child pressing against a fragile sleep. She had agreed to a week. She had not agreed to be part of an inheritance. Her instinct was to draw a line, to state boundaries in clear professional language. The house had silence and voice in equal measure, and now she felt both. "I'll keep my boundaries," she said simply. She meant it, with the quiet insistence that had let her survive her last year. She had learned to speak plainly about what she would and wouldn't do. It was how she protected herself. Dominic heard their conversation from the doorway. He stepped forward, and the weight of his position settled heavily between him and the two women. "No one will use you," he said. "You are here by choice. I will ensure you leave when you want to." Teresa looked at him as if measuring the heartbeat behind his assurance. "Words are wind, Mr. Santoro," she said. "We must prepare." So they prepared. Dominic called in a few favors that he had avoided using for appearance's sake: vehicles with no license plates parked where they could be put to use, messages sent in quiet code. He did not like calling in debts. He disliked bartering in human currency. But he would do what was necessary. For Sarah, the days in the house were a study in contrasts. The estate's stone corridors swallowed sound. The staff moved with an efficiency that made her nursing rounds smooth and mechanized. She was given a little room above the nursery with a view of the enclosed gardens. At night, she fell asleep to the hum of the estate, which was not a lullaby, but the low thrum of a machine that insisted on permanence. She had expected to feel small in such a place, to be overwhelmed with wealth, but instead she found a kind of anonymity that allowed her to do the things she'd come to do: feed, change, soothe, and chart progress. She began to notice the ways Dominic watched from afar. He did not hover. He did not flood the room with protection. He became the kind of presence that slipped into peripheral vision and became central by degrees. They moved in a shape that was not yet intimacy, but not strictly business. Shared meals, small conversations about schedules, the exchange of CDs that neither expected to play. He told her about Isabella in fragments: the way she laughed too loudly at bad jokes, the way she chose tiny wildflowers for the table. He did not tell her about the negotiation of alliances or the calculus of his life. Those things he saved for Luca. But in private, he was not all iron. He was also a man whose grief made him clumsy at meals, and who sometimes cried without fully understanding why he had started. Sarah shared fragments of Emma in similar staccato. She spoke about a short laugh, a favorite stuffed rabbit, a song she had hummed when she worked night shifts on the ward. Sometimes she would have a moment of panic, a sudden terror over the possibility of another loss, and Dominic would stay near without speaking. He seemed to sense the edges of her vulnerability and to respect them. They developed a rhythm. Marco slept longer and fed more predictably. The sound that had once shattered first class became a faint punctuation in their days. Sarah watched him grow in small increments: a longer nap time, a stronger cry when hungry, a reluctant smile that made Dominic's whole face fold in. She placed bottles in a small cupboard, washed them with quiet hands, and logged the amounts with the sort of clinical care she had always paid to the fragile. She enjoyed the small triumphs, and each time Marco settled, she felt the old hollowness in her chest fill a fraction. News spread like smoke among the other families. A messenger sent by a rival, a curious question asked to a secondary supplier, a photograph taken from a distance, all of it coalesced into attention. Dominic had long understood the leverage power brought. He had also learned that visibility brought risk. Sarah had not wanted to be a symbol. She had only wanted to help a child. One evening, as rain began to stitch the sky, Luca came to speak with Dominic beside the estate's long windows. The rain distorted the hedges into watercolor smears. "We had a visit," Luca said, "a man from the Moretti family. He asked no questions, but his eyes did all the talking." Dominic's throat tightened, a small, private tightening. The Moretti family had a habit of smelling weakness before anyone else did. Victoriano Moretti, the head of that clan, had ambitions that ran on trajectories Dominic had avoided by making small, careful eliminations and alliances. If Victoriano saw an opportunity to leverage the presence of a woman who had nursed Dominic's child, he might use it. "What did he say?" Dominic asked. "Nothing direct. He sent a plate of pastries, a note. He claimed hospitality. He called the gesture symbolic." Dominic felt the word in his mouth like a pebble. Symbolic. In their world, symbols could be forced into law or ritual if the right pressure was applied. A rival family could claim that Sarah's act, meaningful in the human sense, carried political weight in the old blood law of their circles. Policy could be scrambled into obligation. Words were alchemical there. Meaning and leverage could transmute. "I'll handle it," Dominic said. Luca studied him, then nodded. "You always do." Dominic did not like that such a thing could be said about him with such simplicity. He had spent decades balancing things he did not want to tip. Having a woman who had nursed his son living semi-permanently inside his home complicated that balance. It invited advisors. It created conjecture. It made people test edges. At night, alone in his study with a glass of something amber that tasted more like ritual than relief, Dominic thought of the way Sarah had pressed a small, unremarkable palm to his son and calmed him. He thought of how the world had shifted because of a single, compassionate act. He remembered Isabella's last night, thinned breath, the sterile light, the way he had felt both helpless and furious at a God he had never known how to speak to. There had been moments when he wanted to punish the world for being unfair. There had been moments when he had wanted to withdraw into the coolness of control. Sarah, with a nurse's hands and a mother's memory, had made something he had not expected. She had given him a small, private salvation. That sounded absurd, even in his head. Salvation was the sort of word men like him used in confession and in libraries they never visited. Yet the idea lodged like a seed. Outside, the estate's lights blinked beacons across the hedges. A message had arrived that afternoon, anonymous, folded into the staff mail. It had been a simple thing, a photograph of Sarah, from across a street, with a caption that suggested the world might be eager to turn her kindness into a political weapon. Dominic looked at the photograph and felt an old machinery begin to warm. Defense, strategy, contingency. He stepped into the nursery once more that night. Marco slept a small, even sleep. Sarah sat in the low chair, feeding a book to distract her, eyes tired but steady. When Dominic entered, she looked up and gave him a small, private smile, the kind reserved for people who had been given a reprieve from grief, even if only for a night. "We have visitors coming," he said. She did not flinch. She had expected as much. "I'll be careful." "No one will coerce you," he said. "If you ever want to leave—" She held up a hand. "I know. I'm not staying because of obligation," she said. "I'm staying because you asked, because Marco needed me. If you think they can make it anything else, they'll have to try. There was a hard knowledge in her voice that Dominic respected. She would not be moved easily. She had been through mud enough times to recognize when someone tried to trample her into a narrative for someone else's use. That night, sleep came in splinters for both of them. Dominic dreamed of Isabella's laughter turning into a crowd's jeer. Sarah dreamed of Emma's small face turning into someone else's demand. Their dreams were different architectures of the same fear, loss, and the precariousness of being needed. The next day, as sunlight uncoiled over the estate, a car arrived with a more formal bearing. It was not merely hospitality. It had the measured presence of a mission dressed in civility. A messenger in a bespoke suit handed Dominic an envelope. He opened it and read the single line written on a sheet of paper that could have fit on any desk. "We should speak about the woman who feeds your son." Dominic folded the paper and set it aside. He looked toward the nursery where Sarah was washing a bottle, her motions steady as a metronome. He understood then that this small domestic arrangement had become an axis. It was a pivot around which men could calculate advantage. He did not like that he was being made to choose between the life he wanted for his son and the calculations of men who would use any human thing as a lever. He chose to make another kind of calculation. He would protect Sarah not because tradition demanded it, but because he would not let his son be used as currency. He would do so forcefully if necessary, but he would also begin, for the first time in years, to think of an exit for himself, not a legal one, not an elaborate renaissance of legitimacy, but a way to fold his power into something that allowed him to lay down the things he had carried. It was a vague, audacious notion, one he kept like a foolish candle in a cellar. He had saved his son with a stranger on a plane. Now he would have to save the stranger from a world that saw her as a symbol. He would have to protect what he loved without letting the methods by which he had built his life swallow the ordinary kindness that had saved him. The photograph on the desk, the note in the envelope, the quiet arrival of men who asked in soft voices, these small things began to stack. Each of them had gravity. Each asked for a response. Sarah sat at the nursery window and watched the hedges. She knew the stakes even as she tried to maintain a professional distance. She had not signed on to be a prize in anyone's game. She had not wanted to be anything but a mother to someone for a little while. But in a house that practiced power like liturgy, everything became a sermon. She had to decide where to stand, and whether to stand with a man who wielded danger like a protective cloak. When she made her choice, the choice to stay another day, to keep helping Marco feed on bottles, to be present for a child who needed her, she did it with her eyes open. She was not naive. She was a woman who had been through grief and had learned how to build boundaries that could be defended by paper and by words. She trusted Dominic to keep his word because she had seen him do things the right way before. He had honored Isabella by keeping the nursery as it was. He had called in favors to protect staff. He had not made the estate a show of violence. Yet she knew there were other forces at work. The Morettis would not simply watch from a distance. In their world, an invitation could be a wedge, and Sarah had been invited, quietly, discreetly, by a man with a wallet that would do him no credit for his intentions. That afternoon, as light poured into the nursery and Marco gurgled in his sleep, Sarah informed Dominic that she would not sign anything she did not read. She would not be bound by ritual she did not choose. She was careful with her words, precise. Dominic listened, and the lines etched on his face softened. "You'll have privacy," he promised. "You'll have your leave. You can go when you wish." She drew a small map of her boundaries right there. No public recognition, no comment to families, and she would be paid. The Santoro estate wrote terms in the blunt language of profit and protection. Teresa and Luca negotiated the edges with the practicality of people who knew how to make misfortune inconvenience its seekers. They drafted contracts, they drew up schedules. The week became a measurable thing, not an open-ended, undefined drift. Yet even as paperwork turned the situation into a tractable set of obligations, the world outside prepared in ways that could not be penned. The photograph had been a small spearhead. Questions would follow. Men with patient faces would begin to whisper. The Morettis would test. The Santoro name would be countered with strategies. And Dominic would have to decide whether to answer with the machinery of his empire or to do the unthinkable he had begun to imagine, give it away. When the sun set that evening and the nursery lights dimmed to a soft lamp glow, Sarah sat beside Marco and traced the shape of his clenched fist. Dominic stood at the doorway like an apologetic sentinel and for a moment forgot the calculations and let himself be human. He had a son who had been quieted by a single, life-saving touch. He had a woman who had given that touch, and he had enemies who wanted to translate human kindness into political leverage. The world had narrowed to the small, luminous ring of a crib. Outside, the estate's hedges breathed with rain and wind and the slow turning of the sea. Inside, hands that had once been trained to harden were softening, and that felt dangerous in ways neither of them could name fully. They had both crossed thresholds, Sarah from loss to a fragile re-engagement with life, Dominic from dominion to the possibility of surrender. Neither of them knew yet how the rest of the house, the families that circled their name, nor the rival whose pastry had come with an edge of insult, would respond. They only knew that the immediate work was right in front of them: feed the baby, soothe the grief, keep the lines of consent and agency intact. So they settled into the rhythms of the day, unaware that a message, sent by a hand they would soon know by name, was already crossing the city, an unsigned threat dressed as courtesy, a note meant to test whether kindness could be coerced into claim. The first move had been made. The rest would require choices that neither of them could make easily. The unsigned note reached its destination by dusk. It arrived folded into a manila envelope left on a bench near the Santoro compound's servant entrance, where a courier knew the rhythm of shift changes. Someone had taken a photograph of Sarah in a cafe days earlier and printed it with an annotation. Symbols are worth more when someone acts on them. It was an elegant sentence meant to read like flattery, like a social cue. In the world Dominic inhabited, it read like a hand on a trigger. The first real strike came without fanfare. A delivery truck halted outside the main gate one evening, engines cut and lights off, as if it were a vehicle waiting for permission to be allowed into sleep. It carried flowers for a family memorial. It carried a bomb disguised in the cradle of roses. Teresa found it. She was the sort of person who checked the small things, the serration of stamps on envelopes, the cadence of engine idling in the lane, the way a courier's hands fumbled with a clipboard. She knew grief could be weaponized. She also knew the Santoro estate's grief had enemies who preferred weapons refined to cruelty. She smelled the wrongness in the flowers before anyone else had time to see the wire and the small, ugly speck of metal nestled in tissue paper. She moved like she always had, silent, efficient. The truck never entered the main courtyard. Luca, waiting, as always, with a patience born of years in a violent profession, stepped out into the cold and assessed the threat with a practical, narrow focus. A small explosion rocked the lane, far enough not to kill a single house guest, but loud enough to send a message: "We know where your soft things are." The blast shattered a greenhouse across from the nursery. Glass rained like clear teeth. A staff gardener lost a hand's worth of soil to smoke. Marco slept through it, cushioned and protected in his sealed crib. Sarah woke with a start in the chair, the sound like an animal's cry in her chest. Dominic pushed into the nursery with the same instinct that had made men survive bullets: speed, command, the precise placement of authority. No one knew who had wanted to test Santoro that night. Luca suspected the Morettis, their methodology, their appetite for symbolic cruelties. The delivery had been a mockery of domesticity. Dominic stared at the wrecked greenhouse, at Teresa, who had her face brayed tight with worry, at Luca, who read the damage as one more calculation. "Get people safe," he said. The words were spare, but they moved through the estate like a current. He wanted to say he would retaliate, but he held the word like a bitter pill on his tongue. Retaliation would be the language his enemies expected. Forgiveness or restraint would be a grammar they might not parse. The next assault was darker. It arrived in the form of men moving at night, a shadow force answering a different calculus. They sought to turn negotiation into kidnapping. That was the measure of the Moretti's charm: make a situation so messy that blood seemed the only possible solvent. The night the safe room was breached, the house was in an odd hush. Rain had pressed the windows to the glass like hands. The staff moved to their posts under Teresa's direction. Lanterns, scheduled check-ins, the soft, resigned competence of people used to being the buffers between titled heads and the world's knives. Dominic had been in his library when Luca's voice came to him, low, steady, the sound that meant immediate trouble. "They're inside the perimeter," Luca said without cadence. He had 3 men with him. "We've got a distraction at the east wall. 2 dead cameras." They moved silent. Dominic felt the world condense to the weight in his chest. He had accepted the cost of his life. He had not accepted that anyone would reach into the fragile center of it to claim his son or the woman who had nursed him. He barked orders with brevity, the practical voice of a man whose job was to think 3 moves ahead. Locks, pathways, routes. But even plans have holes. A hole can be someone's courage, someone's mistake, someone's impatience. The attackers were methodical. They used old family knowledge: an ex-employee who had left under a quiet cloud, a night shift guard who changed his route for the wrong amount, a ladder propped against a service wall. Domestic staff shouted, dogs barked, and in the nursery the sound of something bright and small, Marco's cry, pierced the mayhem. The safe room's steel door shuddered under battering. Dominic and Luca reached the nursery as the second wave of men pushed toward the east wing, a smear of motion and intent. "Take the boy," one of the attackers snarled, a voice like gravel. He reached in like the world owed him. For a second there was a dangerous, brief geometry: iron and small fists, the desperate hands of people who thought ownership could be taken. Sarah moved before thought caught up. She had been trained to identify risk and act with a clarity honed by less lyrical things than heroism. She scooped Marco, wrapping him to her chest, moved through the nursery door with the kind of deliberate speed a nurse learns in neonatal wards. Her feet hit the corridor in a stride that dismissed fear, replaced it with a single functioning thing: protect what could not be protected. There was a moment when she looked up and saw Vittorio Moretti's face. He was not the man who sent polite pastries. He was the man behind those notes. He had eyes like a judge accustomed to deciding fates, and a mouth that found cruelty amusing. He moved with the certain arrogance of a man who believed symbols could be bought if you had the courage to make a public claim. "You feed a Santoro child," he said, as if that offered some ceremonial imprimatur. "You belong to us now in practice, even if not by law." Sarah's jaw clenched. She considered the small line she had drawn, the week, the contract, her choices. She would not be moved by the pretense of ritual. For a fleeting breath, she thought of Emma. Her laugh paused like a recording. She felt the old, irritable pain and a new flame of protective fury. Someone could not stand in a doorway and trade her child for leverage. "Do not touch him," Dominic said. He was between Victorio and the nursery, and the sight of him in that hallway was like oil on an exposed spark. He was not wholly armor, he was flesh too, but the room felt larger with him in it, or perhaps the world simply understood the stakes more clearly when he was the outline. Victoriano's men hesitated. Someone inside the Moretti crew still respected the old courtesies of criminal life. Certain lines, even if dishonest, had to be observed when men faced other men. But an entourage of a rival family had a different appetite that night. A grenade thrown in the corridor would have homogenized courage and terror. Instead, they chose capture. It happened fast. Sarah felt a shove from behind, the blindfolding roughness of someone who had decided that claiming leverage required a hostage. Her hands tightened around Marco. She thought of the way milk smelled, of the small miracles that were not miracles. Warmth, contact, the human pattern that answered to need. When a gloved hand clamped over her mouth, she did what she always did. Breathed shallow, found an edge of calm, and measured it to an action. Someone had decided that a nurse who had fed a boss's baby could be used like a coin. They were wrong. Dominic's voice tore through the corridor. No! He barked it like a command that might rearrange the physics of the room. Men scuffled, boots on stone. Luca moved like a wraith, his presence multiplied by the team at his back. The Santoro household surged into kinetic defense, bones and bone memory making a shield. But the capture had been too clean, too timed. Sarah felt hands yank her up a service stair, a van waiting with darkened windows beyond the hedgerow. She heard ear-ringing shouts behind her, the metallic bite of a gun being cocked, a voice that said, cool and clear, "We keep the nurse, and the Santoro man returns to us with his hands clean." They pulled her into a vehicle that smelled of stale air and engine oil. Two men in the back complained. One had a rag pressed to a wound on his knuckle. There was something organized about their rush, a logistics of cruelty that said this had been planned. Sarah sat on the cold floor of the van with Marco taped to her chest, like something too precious and impractical for the world. She felt the smallness of him, the soft rise under her hand. Her arms ached with a tired, familiar, domestic tenderness. In the tight metal belly of the vehicle, she folded into memory as armor. She hummed Emma's song quietly, like a charm. The boys in the van did not understand that she was not merely a body they had captured. She was an archive of what it meant to be grounded, to be the repository of soft things. That would complicate their plan. Dominic had 1,000 ways to punish. He did the one that began with a scream. He sent men out like tides, Lucas' team on the road, others combing the city, a contact at the airport pinging car plates, a satellite of favors called upon in the middle of the night. He moved like a man who had been left with nothing else but the single direction of his love for a child. When Teresa filled him in, how they'd taken Sarah, the van's route, the direction of the Moretti's safe house, Dominic did not listen for strategy in her voice. He listened for the timbre of her bravery. It steadied him. He would not negotiate in the way they expected. Dominic did something almost reckless in the quiet of his strategy room. He wrote a single line in a notebook and then tore the page and placed it in his pocket. The line read, in the bluntness of a man who understood theater as power, "I will do it myself." That was all he told Luca. He did not elaborate. Luca knew him well enough to understand that the man who said such things had moved beyond the arithmetic of advantage and into the territory of personal reckoning. The Moretti's safe house sat in a tangle of old warehouses near the river, a place where the city had chosen not to be cleaned. They had adverts of fading paint and an alley that stank of rainwater and oil. Dominic approached it in a car with no name, a driver who knew how to make a route invisible, and two men who could move like specters. It felt smaller in person than the messages had suggested. The world made cruelty tangible in yards. He stepped out of the car with the silence of someone who had already practiced how to hold himself in a hallway with a gun. He did not shout. He walked in like a man at a wake, deliberate, measured. He found a rear door and a guard who made the mistake of wanting to be the first enforcer. Luca and the Santoro men were clouds that swallowed him into motion. The fight, when it came, was staccato, a lamp knocked aside, a man's land of breath bellowing, a chair thrown. But Dominic's moves were not just physical. They were the reassertion of a moral axis. He wanted Sarah free. He wanted Marco safe. He did not want to be the man they expected him to be. They brought Sarah forward, blindfolded and bound, but stubborn with an energy that made those who tied her hands uncomfortable. She held Marco close like a vow. The Moretti's leader stepped into the light, Vittorio, his face a pale mask of amusement and calculation. He had thought this was a scene he could stage. "You fed his child," Vittorio said to Sarah, the public portion of his cruelty. "You tied yourself to a name that isn't your own. You will now be the proof that this family owes something to anyone who claims their right." She looked at him. Her voice was a thread of control. "You will not get him," she said. "You can take me, you can take my sleep, you can take my silence. You cannot trade a child for a promise." Vittorio smiled as if enjoying the paradox. The men around him shifted. "Promises have a cost," he said. "You know that, Santoro. I'm willing to exercise leverage that forces a choice. Return what we ask, or we make your world smaller." Dominic heard those words and felt a kalimba of decisions. He could have ordered them all to be killed where they stood. He could have turned the room into the kind of wreckage his reputation would have demanded, the sort of demonstration that would remove opponents and leave him cleansed in blood. He had staked his life on the language of iron and fear for a generation. It had protected him, but it had also set traps that exacted payment. When Sarah met his eyes across the strip of distance, she did something that unsettled him. She held his gaze not with the pleading he expected, but with a steady, rational light. "Don't become what he expects you to be," she mouthed, though Vittorio's men could not know the exchange. She had learned the hard lesson of survivors. You must pick which storms to weather. Choosing to kill Vittorio would make another war possible, and while Dominic had hands, it was not certain that those hands could hold what would come after. She knew about cycles. She had seen their arc in hospital rooms where vengeance and sorrow had no currency. Dominic moved toward his choice like a man walking to confession. He spoke loudly so the men in the room would hear it. "I will come to an arrangement," he said. He spoke in the language of men who sit at tables. "You want a repayment? Fine. Meet me tomorrow at dawn in the old parish. I'll bring a ledger. We can write it down." Vittorio's men blinked at the benign offer. Their leader's face slit into a grin that mistook diplomacy for weakness. He accepted. They moved Sarah into a location that smelled of diesel and closed windows. She kept Marco close, humming the old song. Dominic left a sheet for the men in the room and a look that said he would not be cornered. He returned to his men and to the hum of planning that was a different kind of theater. That night, Dominic did not sleep. Don Calabrese called him at 3 a.m, offering the thin rope of ritual that bound the houses more than contracts did. "You must be careful, Don," the elder said with the gravelly voice of a man who'd seen too many funerals. "Symbols cut deeper than bullets sometimes." Dominic heard in Don Calabrese's words both a warning and a lifeline. He wrote the ledger Vittorio demanded with a clarity that felt like scalpel work. In it, he placed numbers and terms that were designed to satisfy, but in the margins he wrote strings of ceremonial gestures that would diffuse symbolism by converting it into bureaucracy. He offered a public performance, a transfer of certain assets to a cousin who would become public face, an arrangement that preserved the family's needs but allowed Dominic to step back from daily operations. It would be messy, it would be expensive, but it might save lives. He brought the ledger to the parish nave at dawn as promised. It was a neutral, old place where banners had been moth-eaten by time. It smelled of incense, even though modern hands had stopped using such things. Vittorio arrived like a cat that had learned to be theatrical. Cameras, Quiet, handheld devices the size of palms crept at the edges. Old men came with the currency of oaths. Dominic entered with his face the flatness of someone who had made a choice and would not be moved. The negotiations were terse. They were ultimatums dressed as honor. Bones of pride were placed on the table. In private, Dominic offered terms that were plausible to men whose instincts were to win. He offered the Santoro name continuity under a ceremonial successor, Marco's cousin, who would take the public mantle of Don in the eyes of skeptical families. It was a political performance that Don Calabrese helped script, a way to allow Dominic to leave, yet keep the facade intact, to grease the old wheels without oiling his hands. Victoriano took the ledger and read the numbers like a man measuring a tablecloth. He set the pen down and considered the theatricality of the bargain. "You are giving up honor," he said, as if honor were a single coin and not a litany of careful decisions. He wanted a spectacle, a bloodied step in front of his house's cameras. He wanted Dominic to make a slaughter of his principles so that he might be mocked. Dominic stood still. "I am giving up blood," Dominic said quietly, "and I'm keeping my son." There was a pause. Outside the church, a gull cried like the edge of a memory. The Victoriano's face tightened. He could not wear this kind of compromise easily. His chest wanted things simpler and more brutal. But a ledger was a bargain. It would be respected, counted, and owed. Men like Victoriano understood currency. He accepted the terms because, in the end, he could also regale his house with a narrative he chose. He had extracted a concession and could say he'd forced even a Don to bend. They left with Sarah untouched and Marco cradled in her arms. Dominic had given them a stage, and they had accepted the script. But the bargain had consequences not only political, but personal. Dominic's renunciation would not simply be a piece of paper, it would be the erosion of the thing that had defined him. It would require softening his habits, retraining his reflexes. He had promised himself he would do it for Marco and for Sarah, and perhaps, in a small, stubborn corner, for himself, so that the shape of his grief would not calcify into permanent hardness. Back at the estate, Teresa greeted Sarah like she'd returned from the dead. Sarah felt her knees tremble in the doorway, the small dizziness of someone who had been taken and placed again. She looked at Dominic and saw exhaustion framing him like a crown. He had not been clean in the bargain. The ledger and the parish and the quiet exchange had cost him something. They both knew it. "You did it because you had to," Sarah said finally, settling Marco on her hip and feeling how his small weight reoriented her body. "But you didn't have to do it because they asked you to kill him. You didn't have to be them." Dominic's laugh was short and damp. "I could have made a show of it," he said. "I could have made the world tremble and then realized I had nothing left to tremble for." He met her eyes. "You told me not to become what they expect." I remembered. She moved closer, and he let himself be human, a small concession in a life that had not been generous with them. She kissed him then, a slow, precise thing that was consent and claim both. He answered with a tenderness that had been gathering like rain behind a dam. This kiss did not erase the night. It purchased an intimacy that would have to be paid for every day after, with choice. The families watched, as families do. The Santoro name needed a palatable story. Dominic's decision to step back was arranged like theater and legal paper, a ceremony where he would pass the title to Marco's cousin and then take a different oath, one of retirement from directives, of refusal to sit at the table of daily business. It infuriated traditionalists and pleased negotiators. It cleared the air. There was resistance. Men whose fortunes had been tied to Dominic's daily presence considered mutiny. Luca made a speech in the private chambers, not flamboyant, but plain. Loyalty was not transactional, it was ethical. He reminded them of lives that had been spared by Dominic's restraint, of debts that had been paid. Don Calabrese brokered a ceremony where Dominic's hand was symbolically closed and passed on. They argued in private rooms about assets and titles and the right faces to present at public events. The Santoro machine creaked and then found a way to pivot. As Dominic's public role folded back like a map being put away, Sarah found herself in a strange new orbit. She was no longer simply the temporary nurse. She was a woman who had been a fulcrum of change, a dangerous and luminous role. Men would speak of her over cognac and in private, but the thing that mattered to her was daily: bottles to sterilize, meetings with new caretakers, late nights of lullaby for a child who now slept more evenly than he had months before. The domestic life they negotiated was humble in ways that irritated those in the exterior circles who expected spectacle. They drank coffee in the kitchen and debated the merits of plastic versus glass bottles like a couple on the edge of a different life. Their intimacy matured slowly. They had stolen nights together where grief was admitted in small confessions. Dominic had nightmares and woke with the taste of hospital antiseptic. Sarah would make him tea and hold him while he spoke her name like a prayer. She spoke of Emma without offering cures. She told Dominic that sometimes grief changes shape and sometimes it does not leave at all. He would listen like a man learning to carry a new muscle. When they kissed publicly, it was on their own terms. Dominic asked permission in small gestures. He learned the power of small courtesies, asking before embracing, asking before pushing into another life. Sarah, who had pledged boundaries from the start, let herself become undone in increments. She trusted him because trust had been earned through decisions that cost him something real. The assault on the Santoro estate had been a wedge that invited change. It had forced Dominic to confront not merely enemies, but himself. He found he could live with many things broken and yet not become a man who ceremonially avenged everything. That refusal was not weakness, it was a new kind of courage. The retirement ceremony was quiet in the way that mattered. It was not a coronation, but a kind of carefully staged requiem for a life built on hard edges. Don Calabrese officiated in the low-register way of a man who knew history and scars. Dominic stood at the dais like someone removing armor. He handed the family mantle to Marcos Kevin, a competent, composed man who had been groomed in the right ways, and the room exhaled. There were speeches thanking Dominic for restraint and for the structural integrity he had built. There were austere gestures to maintain face. But privately, Dominic gave different acknowledgments: to Luca for loyalty that went beyond employment, to Teresa for the kind of guardianship that was more mother than manager, and to Sarah, whose name he said aloud and then repeated as if to make sure the world heard it. "Because of you," he told her, "my son learned to sleep a little more easily. Because of you, I am leaving a life that would have taken him from me in other ways." His voice was a gravel of softness. He did not promise absolution. He promised a future he would try to keep alive. The choice to marry was not spur of the moment. It arose from the slow accumulation of trust and the necessity of making public permission to share a life. For Sarah, the decision was also a practical one. Marriage would offer certain legal protections, a public statement that shielded both her and Marco from continual rumor and commodity. It would also complicate things. Dominic recognized that. He made sure she signed her consent into every public and private document, swearing that she entered not because tradition had ensnared her, but because she chose to join a new kind of household. They married quietly in the estate's small chapel 3 months later. Dominic stood with a suit that had been altered to fit a man who had softened in posture. Sarah wore a simple dress the color of late-turned wheat and carried a bouquet stolen from the estate's unthreatened garden. It was not ostentation, but it was not small either. It was their way of saying yes in a world that had been authoritative. Teresa stood beside Sarah, a godmother of sorts. Luca was present but not showy, his eyes steady as if guarding a child. Don Calabrese offered a blessing that was careful not to read like a contract. The ceremony was not a pledge to erase the past, but to make a new arrangement that honored the living. Their honeymoon was not abroad. It was a rented cabin on the edge of Montana they had visited in a brief, secret trip months earlier. They had felt the geography of the place like an honest map. Mountains unsentimental and honest, trees that did not ask for the scent of perfume, cold mornings and honest wood stoves that made them both laugh. They agreed not to move fully there at first. The relocation would be gradual, but the idea of Montana, wide, cold, honest, became the image they held onto as Dominic severed his daily ties. They moved in stages. Dominic placed trusted managers, people who would run the enterprise but would report into a trust rather than to him. Luca became chief of security in the way an adult assumes a caretaker role rather than an enforcer. Some men left in quiet discontent. Others stayed because they had relationships deeper than a title. Sarah and Dominic found domestic peace in rituals that were banal and therefore holy. Early morning diaper changes, a late-night feeding where they traded tired jokes, the ritual of steam cleaning bottles in the small kitchen of a rented house. There were arguments. They were not the kind of melodramatic quarrels that strip love of dignity, but small, human cracks where boundaries were tested and then mended. Marco learned to find his mother's scent and his father's voice. He grew into a child who made Dominic laugh like a man at the end of the world and not at war with it. The narrative of a mafia boss's child became, in a quiet corner of the country, the story of a small family that knew its past like a scar. The Morettis raged in other places. Victoriano found ways to extend influence where the Santoro presence was less organized. He tried legal challenges. He sought to turn the narrative into gossip. The world would always dabble in cruelty, but Dominic had replaced some of his arsenal with careful, quiet allies. He did not expect to be forgiven by men like Victoriano, but he no longer wanted their approval. Months folded into a year. Dominic sold some of his properties legally, the kind of liquidations that required lawyers and the kind of ceremonial gestures that would satisfy watchful eyes. Don Calabrese mediated the transfer of visible titles. The Santoro name remained. Its daily administration lay in the hands of a cousin who kept public functions in the right tone. Dominic, by design, became a father and a husband first, and a man with a difficult past second. He did not transform overnight. Some mornings he woke and found his fingers wanting to reach for a different phone, for the ledger, for the numbers. He resisted those motions. He found new muscle in the slow practice of domestic life. He learned to make pancakes when Sarah taught him, and responded when Marco called for him at night. Those were his new battles, wrestling with the small, precious ordinariness of family. Sarah's grief did not vanish. It settled into a different architecture. She had moments where Emma's absence felt like a shadow at the window. Some nights she cried in the bathroom and Dominic sat outside and listened, without asking how he might fix the irreparable. He had learned that absence could not be filled. It had to be lived alongside. Love became committed memory, an acceptance of all that had been lost and all that she could still give. One autumn evening, as snow hinted at the edges of Montana's air, Sarah held Marco and leaned into Dominic. He watched her fingers, always practiced, always busy with the small things a child demanded. He saw the soft, familiar callus on her thumb from late-night feedings, and the way she smelled faintly of baby laundry and dream. He felt a quiet informing that their life was right because it had been consciously chosen. He felt the world he had left shrank to something kinder. They had dinner with Luca and Teresa, guests who had become family by different paths. Teresa had her practical ways and comforted Sarah like an aunt. Luca told stories that were bare of embellishment, the sort that revealed loyalty without righteousness. They laughed about small missteps. Dominic's first attempt at macaroni burned to shame, and their laughter knitted them. Dominic excused himself to the porch, where the air smelled of imminent snow. He stood there like a man not quite sure how to make an admission without it sounding like capitulation. When he returned, Sarah looked at him with that directness that had first disarmed him in a plain lavatory, the look of someone who asked for consent without theatricality. He placed a hand on her belly in a slow, careful way. There was not yet anything to feel. It was an offering of intent. They had not yet spoken of more children. To bring a new life into a family built on the bones of these decisions was something they wanted to approach with care. They had planned meticulously to avoid repeating the past. In the months that followed, small domestic miracles performed the tasks of healing. Marco's first crooked tooth, his lisp, his terror of thunderstorms that made Dominic get up at midnight to stand by the crib, talking in the low voice of stories his father had taught him. Sarah found work at a small clinic in the nearest town, where she could be good without being defined by the Santoro name. It suited her. She found that honor did not have to be flashy. It could be the kind of quiet competence that allowed people to breathe. One morning, Sarah realized with a small, irrepressible shock that she had been nauseous for weeks and had not registered the signs in the practical way she might have before. The test was a private thing, done in the slow light of their kitchen. Dominic's hand shook when she showed it to him. He looked like a man who had been offered an apology from the future. They both laughed and then cried and then laughed again, a messy, uncoordinated trio of relief. When the doctor confirmed their news, the technical, whispered news in a small office that they were expecting, both felt the complicated warmth that came from the intersection of joy and memory. Sarah thought of Emma with tender sorrow and a soft, stubborn hope that grief had not erased possibility. They did not proclaim the pregnancy like a victory flag. They told Luca and Teresa in the evening over simple pasta. Teresa had tears, not of surprise, but of approval. Luca made a joke about feeding schedules, and Dominic hit him with a thrown olive. The house was a little louder and a little safer for it. The world still circled their name. News outlets sniffed at the edges of their quiet life. Old enemies tried small bureaucratic pings to needle them back into conflict. Dominic parried with a new muscle, the refusal to be baited. He would not fight the old fights with the old weapons. He had learned to choose the battles that protected his family and allowed him to keep his soul. Months later, on a winter morning when the world was sharp and the air had the clean edge of reasons kept honest, Sarah sat in a small rocking chair in a nursery they had painted together, soft gray with a band of pale blue at the ceiling, and fed the baby they had adopted into their life through choices and quiet. Marco slept across a small, well-worn blanket embroidered by Teresa. Dominic stood beside them and brushed a thumb across Sarah's hair. She smiled up at him, and the room felt like an answer. "Do you remember that flight?" she asked. How could she not? The plane's lavatory, a memory that still carried a strange holiness. The image had become their shared origin story. He did. He remembered the smell of the engine and the small wrongness of a man reduced to needing help. "I remember the way you breathed," he said. "I remember how you refused to let me hold on to only iron." She laughed. "You cried in public. You were the reason." He put his forehead to hers. "You were also the reason I started to want a different kind of life." They were not innocent about the fact that their public choices had consequences. They were realistic about the cost of immunity. They would still have to be cautious. Money and power could still be dangerous. But they were married, and they had made a choice that prioritized fatherhood and marriage over the currency of dominance. Time, which had once been a ledger of losses, became a gardener. It tended them. The pockmarks of the past remained, but the house, this new life, grew a canopy of patient, shared rituals. There were moments they were pulled back, an unexpected photograph, an anonymous letter, but they had learned to treat those intrusions as noise rather than prophecy. One night, as the house settled into the kind of hush that meant small people were asleep, Dominic stood by the nursery window and watched snow lay a soft coat across the Montana fields. He placed Sarah's palm on his chest and felt her heartbeat against the outline that had once meant a life of iron and war. He had traded architectured violence for the precariousness of living tenderly. He had made the unthinkable transaction of giving up the thing that would have protected him from himself. The plains and the lavatory and the first day remained a shimmering axis in their private history, a story told to friends who listened with an appetite for romantic drama, a story repeated at the odd dinner where curiosity wanted myth. It was the moment when a woman's small kindness reconfigured a man's map. It remained luminous, yes, but not because it was sensational, because it was human and therefore possible. In the end, Dominic's renunciation did not erase his past, it reshaped it. The Santoro name continued in the world as a force, but it no longer demanded that he be its merciless embodiment. He kept a hand in sensible counsel, but no longer let his hands be the first instruments of blood. He stood as a man who had learned that power could be translated into the protection of a life rather than the humiliation of enemies. Their life was not a fairy tale. There were days when Sarah felt fear flash, triggered by some innocuous sound. There were nights when Dominic dreamed of blood and woke sweaty, apologizing to rooms. There were practical arguments about money, about where Marco would go to school, about how to explain their past to a child who deserved the simplest truth they could afford. When their second child was born, a quiet boy with a stubborn tuft of dark hair, Dominic held both children and felt an ache like a prayer. He had been reduced once to the helplessness of a man whose child cried in a plane and who needed a stranger's hands. A single act had unraveled and re-wove his life into something that allowed mercy. He had done the unthinkable twice. First, accepting a stranger's help. Second, surrendering his empire for a family. They named the new boy with a name that honored the small, complicated history that had brought them to this mesa of peace. At night, when the house had the kind of silence that is an honest presence rather than a vacuum, Sarah would sometimes wake and look at the sleeping faces and whisper a name of thanks to a god or a world that had been less cruel than they feared. Dominic would awake, and sometimes he would record his gratitude in small, practical ways. A new trust for Marco's future, a simple memorial that honored Isabella without turning her into an idol. Years later, when strangers would ask Dominic about the photograph of a pale woman breastfeeding in the cramped circle of a plain lavatory, a photograph that had later been retold as a myth, he would not romanticize it. He would tell the truth. She fed my son because she's a nurse and because she was kind. I was too proud to ask, and then I was too ashamed to refuse help when it came. And Sarah would add, at the same table years later, where they now sat without the need to perform anything, I acted because it was right for the child. I stayed because I wanted to watch him grow. We both made choices. They had both chosen. That was the heart of the story. Choice, consent, the tiny radical acts of care that could reconfigure even violent architectures. The plain lavatory was their Genesis story, yes, but their lives afterwards were the real narrative, a sequence of small mercies, of consent asked and given, of a man who learned to be soft and a woman who let herself soften without losing her edges. When the video of the day they fed their child in a cramped cabin surfaced years later, the internet made it caricature. There were headlines that tried to turn it into myth, and men who tried to sell the violence of the past like memory. But the version their family told was quieter, truer, A woman who had once lost a child, who reached into unknown kindness. A man who learned what he had been missing and made choices that protected that new light. The rest was the life they built, with messy afternoons, with love that sometimes resembled a truce and sometimes a covenant. If this story found its way to you and stayed with you, consider staying for more like it. Stories about fractures and repair, about people who refuse to be defined by their worst hours. If you were moved, like and subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good redemptive tale.